departmental distinction the Chinese government said it found irrelevant, all of which has prompted questions over whether government crackdowns on press freedoms in China may have contributed to the expansion of the virus. The Wall Street Journal editorial board responded to the expulsions, writing, "What Chinese officials don't understand is that a free press would have helped them better cope with the virus fallout." And don't forget that last year, at least 48 journalists were arrested and detained by the Chinese government, earning them the title of the world's most repressive regime for press freedom. That's from the Committee to Protect Journalists. In the wake of this crisis, at least 2 Chinese vloggers, Chen Jieren and Fan Bing, who were dedicated to covering the outbreak in Wuhan, have since disappeared. And according to the Financial Times, VPN services allowing locals to circumvent internet censorship are being attacked by the Chinese government. Joining me now to discuss is BuzzFeed News correspondent Megha Rajagopal, who, along with 3 expelled Wall Street journalists, has been covering Uyghur surveillance and detention in China. She was forced out of the country in 2018 when her visa was not renewed. Megha, thank you so much for joining us. You have on-the-ground experience in this. First of all, were you struck that 3 Wall Street Journal reporters from the Beijing bureau were so summarily removed over this headline? Is there any merit at all? Certainly, I will disclose, does not seem that way to me. Or is it simply an attempt to distract from the coronavirus?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's pretty clear that the retaliation by the Chinese government was disproportionate relative to the headline. The headline clearly was problematic and offended a lot of people, both inside and outside of China, many of whom have no allegiance to the government. But as you said, the 3 reporters had nothing to do with the writing of the headline. And because the Chinese government has retaliated so frequently against journalists who, refuse to toe the party line and write critically about the government in the past, it's really hard to accept this explanation at face value.
I will say that no one in China could have seen the headline because the Wall Street Journal, as they point out in their editorial, has been taken offline by the Chinese government since 2014. And also they say that the Beijing is trying to exploit, quote, America's identity politics to Charles racism in service of its censorship around the headline. It's, I believe, a reference to the Ottoman Empire, back in World War I. But there's a deeper connection between you and the 3 Wall Street Journal reporters I want to highlight, because it's in some ways bigger than the coronavirus cover-up. It's that you all have covered the Uyghur concentration camps. Do you think that's a coincidence, or do you think that's an underlying reason the Chinese have taken this action?
So I was incidentally the first reporter to find and visit one of the camps. And when we put a story out on BuzzFeed News in 2017, a lot of people read it. And the Chinese government has never said to me that me being forced out was in retaliation for that particular story. But in private conversations, they've criticized my reporting on human rights on many, many occasions, as they do for lots of journalists that are based in China. So it certainly feels like retaliation. And I think if you look at all of the journalists that have been forced out since 2012, up until these 3 Wall Street journals that have just been expelled, a lot of them have reported on human rights, and particularly on the crisis in Xinjiang.
And let's go also at the crisis in Wuhan, because that's what's happening right now. You have journalists who are isolated, people who are isolated, and these Chinese vloggers who've been disappeared. And the pattern that I think is so troubling and sinister for folks is that even the Chinese people recognize that the doctor who initially reported the virus, who was suppressed and then subsequently died from the virus that he was the first to try to identify, that there's a pattern here. But we know how this works, that this impulse to censor bad news only compounds the underlying problem. Is this going to be more pervasive, or do you think it could even be a tipping point for the Chinese people who recognize that this pandemic has been made worse by an attempt to cover it up?
Well, it's interesting because, press freedom is in kind of a dire situation in China.
Yeah.
But in the wake of the death of this doctor, we've seen sort of a tentative opening up in some sense, because people are so upset about what happened, and sort of rightly so. When the SARS crisis happened in China, it was a lot of the same problems. There were cover-ups, and it really compounded the issue. And I think in the aftermath of that, there was a lot of recognition that we can't keep the lid on these things so tight, because if there's no information that's leaking out, and if people are sort of incentivized to self-censor, then you end up with a situation where there's not enough public knowledge of the intensity of the crisis.
But we haven't really seen that learning curve taking effect this time around.
It certainly seems, like there are real attempts to cover up important information about it.
And do you think that more foreign reporters will continue getting kicked out, particularly ones who speak Chinese fluently?
Probably, yeah. I mean, we've seen since the current president, Xi Jinping, took power in 2013, there's certainly been an uptick in the number of foreign reporters that are being thrown out. This is particularly important in China because the local press is so heavily censored.
Yes.
So people really, really depend on international reporters who aren't censored prior to publication to get information about the country. So the more foreign reporters get thrown out, the less people have the ability to know about what's really happening inside China.